Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today, and welcome to this CM Crossroads webcast series broadcast, enabling self-service builds in the enterprise. This webcast is brought to you by CMC Media and CM Crossroads and is sponsored by Urban Code, the makers of Anthill Pro. I'm Patrick Egan, publisher of CM Crossroads and the Agile Journal. I'll be your moderator today for this webcast. Well, in a few moments, Fredrick and Eric Minick will join us to share their practical experience in implementing self-service build automation in the enterprise. But before we begin, let me take care of a few housekeeping details. Our webcast is intended to be interactive, so you have the ability to post a question at any time by using the chat box that you can see down below the presentation screen. You can also use this box to ask questions of other viewers in the audience as well, and we'll follow along as we go through the presentation, and we'll address all of your questions during a Q&A session towards the end. Also, you'll notice that there's a pop-out option that lets you undock the event browser, or the chat browser, so that you don't let it get hidden behind the slides. Also, if you want to follow along with Twitter and Facebook, use the tweet and like buttons at the top of the screen. And don't forget to use the CMCLC hashtag in your tweets so that you can have your tweets appear in the tweet roll you can see on the right side of the screen as well. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, click on the Resources tab to the right of the screen, and then you'll see a button there to download a copy of today's presentation in PDF form. Also, recording the entire live broadcast, including the Q&A, will be available for replay for on demand so that you can watch it again or recommend it to a friend. And that should be up in about 24 hours. Also, if you need to get a closer look at any slide, you just mouse over the presentation window and you'll see a pop-up that says full. If you click on that, it'll expand the browser, the presentation to the full size of your browser window. Well, let me introduce our speakers today. Fredrick is a technical evangelist for Urban Code, and he's been an internationally recognized expert for continuous integration. He's been in the software industry for over 19 years and has performed and managed virtually every role in the software development lifecycle. He's been an early adopter of XP and Agile software development and a top committer for cruise control. Jeffrey has consistently been at the forefront of the industry and currently indulges his passion for improving how software is made as a technical evangelist at Urban Code, as the organizer of the Silicon Valley Meetup, Agile Meetup, and as a co-organizer of Continuous Integration Testing Conference, KitCon. Welcome, Jeffrey. Also joining us today is Eric Minick. Eric Minick is a lead consultant at Urban Code, where he helps customers get the most out of their build and release processes with Anthill Pro. He has 8 years experience in automation throughout the application lifecycle in roles as developer, a test automation engineer, and support engineer. Eric has been at the forefront of continuous integration for over 6 years and has worked on all 3 generations of Urban Hill's Anthill product. To keep up with Eric's latest insights, visit him on the Urban Code blog, and we'll pop out a link for that a little bit later in the program. Well, welcome to the show, guys. If you're ready to go, I'll turn it over to you, Jeffrey.
All right. Thanks for having us, Patrick. And I'm glad to have Eric joining me today. I got to say, one of the challenges of doing a presentation with the lead consultant is that very often he gets called in to do consulting of all things. So I'm glad we avoided that risk today, but really good to have you here with me today, Eric.
It's great to be here.
All right. Now, what we're going to be talking about today really draws upon our experience with customers. We have prospects come to us and who are looking to adopt self-service builds. We're looking to put in place an enterprise build system. And so that's really kind of what the outgrowth of our this presentation is from that experience. One thing that we'll start with is that, self-service builds these days are actually pretty normal. Eric, you want to tell people about this survey that we did?
Yeah, so we put out a survey every couple of years to try to figure out what the state of the industry is, what practices people are performing, and all of that. And what we found when we asked this question, do you have an automated system that allows us to do a consistent, repeatable build, is that over 90% said, yeah, more or less, yes, we do. Either same way every time or with some options. And I think the key thing is, yes, it is very normal, at least at the team level, to have self-service builds.
Yeah, and I think that,
So,
of course, there's probably some selection bias in our audience. People on our mailing list hopefully are above average on their level of adoption maturity. But this also mirrors our experience when we go to accounts, that very often they do have a system in place. And it's not too surprising because it really doesn't take that much to put self-service builds in place. I mean, basically, all you really need are three things. You need an authoritative build machine, like the official build machine of record. You need your defined build steps, which is usually going to be encapsulated in a build script, and then a button that the right people can press to run those steps on that machine. And this is not new. I mean, we're talking about state of the art in 2001, 10 years ago when Ansible OS came out. This kind of thing was possible. So it's not surprising that a lot of people actually have adopted this, at least at the team level, but it's less common to actually have adopted it at the enterprise level. Now, if you're thinking about doing enterprise level self-service builds, you're really going to need to talk to three different audiences. You need to make the case with three different people. First of all, there's the teams who are doing nothing at all. There is the enterprise itself. You need to make the case, and we should invest in a self-service build infrastructure. And then you have those teams that are currently doing self-service builds. They've put a team-level solution in place, and their problems are pretty much solved. And when you're talking to these three different groups, you're going to need to use three different sets of arguments. For the people currently doing nothing, it's probably enough just to explain to them all the benefits of doing a self-service build, right? Because they have nothing and they don't have benefits, and that's great. For the enterprise, not only do you need to explain why do self-service builds, but you need to make the case for why do it at the enterprise level. And then probably the most tricky audience to talk to are those who are currently doing self-service builds. Now, this is especially tricky because these are probably teams that are considered the build experts, the ones who have already taken automation the furthest. People look to them for guidance. So you really need to make the case with them about why to get them on board. And you need to explain to them why they should go along with the change. And you need to answer that fundamental question, what's in it for me? So hopefully through this webinar today, we'll be able to help you answer all three of these audiences. And we're going to do that with this agenda. We're going to start off by, going over the benefits of a self-service build infrastructure, why have one at all. Then we're going to get into what's the benefit of an enterprise or a centralized approach. And then, assuming that you've made the case and you've got people on board, we're going to give you some caveats, some warnings that there are some pitfalls out there to putting some sort of a common build system in place. And finally, we're going to give you a takeaway, an evaluation template that we find to be very helpful when starting off on a project like this. So with those pieces in place, let's go to the first one. Eric, what are the benefits of a self-service infrastructure? Why would anyone care to do this?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on who you ask, right? If you're talking to maybe a central CM team or the business, right, they're going to be focused on things like accurate build processes and control over the process, make sure random things don't get out there. In fact, this is actually how we got into build automation in the first place. We used to be a consulting company, and in one of our consulting contracts, a developer had made some fixes and just said, yeah, we should see if the customer likes these changes. Built it on his desktop, emailed it to the customer, didn't think anything of it. Until 2 weeks later, we got a call from the customer saying, yeah, that stuff you sent over a couple weeks ago, that's looking really good. We're going to put it into production. And we realized that we have no idea where this is coming from. It's not tagged in source control. We don't even know if the code got to source control. We sure hope it did. That's a mess. And so we wanted to make sure that it was easier for our developers to do things the right way, the controlled way, than to do it the wrong way, where they build and ship off their desktop. And I think that's that other audience, right, is the developers. They need things to be easy for them. They're looking for efficiency. They want things to be quicker, use less of their desktop resources, things like that. And so when we're talking to those end users, those developer types, even into QA, it's less about accuracy and control and more about getting things done, being quicker. So those are two big impacts. And then there are those... Go ahead.
I know that a lot of times when companies have these issues on accuracy and control, their first instinct is to put policies in place, right? They establish the role. There is the build master, right? He's going to master our build. He is the person who does the official build, right? Why isn't that a sufficient answer? Why not just use that build person as a way of giving you what you need?
Well, it can give you the control aspect. As long we'll set aside room for human error, and that computers are better at doing things consistently than people. But even setting that aside, really when we go and look at the efficiency, when a developer needs to now make a build request and say, could you please do the build for me? Right? They often want to know, does it compile? Can I get that build back so I can test it on this system? Let's get it to QA quickly. And when we have that intermediary, we call that the Bob the Builder syndrome, the person who's responsible for doing the build. Well, that person will go out to lunch, and sometimes they'll go on vacation. And maybe there'll be coverage and maybe not. They really get pinched for time. They become a bottleneck, and they become a bottleneck most when things are busiest, when we're closest to release. That's when they get the most requests. And so if we can avoid that sort of bottleneck and free that up with some sort of automation, that can really help the developer side of the house. So they embrace the controlled method rather than fighting against it and finding other ways of doing things. Again, I think it's that idea of we want it to be easiest to do things the right way.
Okay,
is there anything you want to add to that?
I think that's compelling. I think that's the sort of the compelling case. I think that initial instinct of putting control in place through a human is laudable, but then brings up that sort of delay. It's sort of that problem of that control has the feeling that most people have is that control means bureaucracy, and that what we're really looking for is the power of automation to both give you control while actually improving efficiency. I think that's the killer combination here. The other thing I know that can be a big deal is that if you have a good controlled build process in place, good automated efficient build process, it really becomes a huge platform for future improvement, right? You can do a lot and build a lot of things off of that that become enhancements later on. So it becomes a tremendous platform. What are some of the ways that you've seen people build off of their build platform to put more things in place?
And a lot of these are up here on the slide. But I think there are a lot of things that happen at build time that are really nice to work in, like unit testing, static analysis runs, some sort of code metrics. To say, once we're doing our builds, let's run a few more tests as part of the build. Let's get feedback to the team as quickly as we can. And that can be really powerful. And then I think there's another level of thing that says, well, once we have a build platform in place, we're going to extend this automation down the life cycle towards the QA teams, even out towards production deployments. So automating those deployments and then running functional tests out in those test environments and tying those results back in. So, depending on whether you're doing things just at build time or stretching out, either way, you've got this platform in place for really expanding and getting more automation and analysis.
Yeah, that's a great point. So for anyone who's out there thinking, with the idea of like, wow, continuous deployment, continuous delivery, that stuff sounds great. You got to start at the basics and getting that build, that first step in place, and then start working out towards there. So I think these are kind of the main arguments that I would make to people for why they'd want to put a self-service build in place. Removing the bottlenecks while maintaining control, as well as then having something you can really build on for the future. So, that's really it is our first agenda point, kind of summed up nice and neat. Hopefully the arguments for this are straightforward. We've had 10 years of experience. We know that this works and builds great benefits. And I think now we want to kind of get into some of the things that might be harder to see, which is the benefits of why you'd actually want a centralized or enterprise approach. And I think the first reason is that, enterprises in general look to for standardization. They have their own internal drivers that if they'd like to standardize their processes. Now, there's some really good reasons for doing that. Eric, you want to share a couple?
Yeah, and I think the first one we have up here is this best practices idea. And we know that people cringe when they see that word. We've seen other consultants use the term leading practices. But rather than just try to say, hey, there are these best practices that someone in a book says that you should do, or someone on a webcast says that you should do, what we're really driving at is that organizations will see one of these teams that have set up self-service builds at the team level and say, boy, that team is really rocking. That's great stuff. We should all do that. We should take this thing that we know works for us and do it more. And so, we always ask that question, why have any of our teams doing something worse or less than what our best teams are doing? And that kind of driver on continuous improvement really is one of the main reasons this happens. And I think the other side of this is just consistency. We want everybody in our organization across the enterprise to be doing things kind of the same way, as consistently as we can. Because that gives us a lot of power, a lot of things we can do. It means that when people change from team to team, which we all know happens, there's a little bit less friction. Right? It's never going to be free to change teams, but we can make it a little bit easier for people to go around. The other side of this is, if we're trying to standardize on some best practice, well, we're probably going to need to train people on it, teach them how to do it, get them on board. And if we're doing things the same way, then that sort of investment that we need to do in training people and making documentation or internal training videos or whatever that is, that becomes a little bit cheaper because we get to do it for one tool rather than saying, all right, everybody go find your own tool to do self-service builds, and maybe we'll give you some guidelines on maybe what you should do, but we can't really help you with that. If we standardize on one tool, then we're going to be able to adopt our best practice more effectively. So I think there's a lot of interplay between this consistency idea and the best practice idea. I think you'd agree with that, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this then can be an argument for people, even when people have already put a team-level solution in place. If there's something admirable they've done, you can say, look, we're trying to use you guys as the template. Yeah, you guys have solved the problem. Our other teams, we'd like them to be as efficient as you are. And that's really why we're looking for it. So I know a lot of people think of the centralized solution that that can have negative connotations again around the sort of the bureaucracy, slow to respond. That doesn't need to be the case. You can have this sort of very benign approach where really you're looking to bring the best ideas out and have everyone adopting them. The other thing too is that this is kind of on more like the cultural side, using the best practices, being consistent everywhere. But there's actually some really solid benefits you get just from using a consolidated tool set, right? You can really make some investments that pay dividends. Eric, you want to walk us through these?
Yeah, and I think we already talked a little bit about the kind of the training aspect of this, but there's also just the hardware aspect. If everybody has to set up their own build infrastructure, right? They're probably each going to have one build machine, maybe two. But if we're able to consolidate that, we could probably have a smaller number of total machines and more throughput for any given team, especially if we're in a situation where we're doing worldwide development, right? We get to use the machine that has been idle while you're asleep for the team that's on the other side of the world, or the other side of the country for that matter. Same sort of thing. When you're moving hot and heavy in development and there's a lot of changes going, maybe you're going to have 3, 4, 5 machines available to you for rapid builds. But while things are a little bit slower, someone else can use that hardware. So we're able to get a little bit more throughput with less hardware. That's a good thing. We're also able to, I think, build that body of knowledge. So if I find something really cool that I'm able to do with the system and say, hey, if you set things up this way, you get all this additional information, or it goes faster, or what have you, it's easier. I'm able to share that, and everybody else in the company is able to take advantage of that. We're able to standardize on, again, those things that work for us, those best practices. And I think you already touched on this a little bit, but this idea of the platform and being able to improve on it is really a key piece. Did you want to run with that a bit more, Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'd like to. Because we mentioned with self-service builds offer a great opportunity to build for the future. And if you have a shared tool set, it's easier to actually make that investment because you can, spread the cost over more teams and you're getting more benefit. So, for example, people might say, well, static analysis sounds like a great thing. We want to look at some commercial tool to do it. If you have a centralized group, then go and put that in place, and wham, everyone now can get the benefit across all the builds. You've taken the amount of time it took to figure out how to integrate that into your build system, make it part of centered infrastructure, and leverage that everywhere rather than having to work through it on a team-by-team basis, right? So it's easier to make that investment, easier to justify, easier to actually implement and get that ROI. And I think, again, we're talking here, I want to focus on that difficult case of those teams that already have a solution in place. And I think the shared infrastructure is a huge one. I mean, partially with the issues that are like disaster recovery probably doesn't happen on the team level so much. If Bob on a team has got his tool for automated builds running on the machine under his desk, probably not running in a fault-tolerant disaster recovery kind of mode. If that goes down, it might take a while to get the build system back up and running. So that sort of robustness might be appeal, but I think the performance is really the killer. And I think hopefully all the people on the call are familiar with queuing theory to understand why having 5, 10, or 15 machines shared across 15 machines is going to give you better throughput than having 5 separate machines, less idle time. So really, that's a win for everyone. You can tell that your best team that, hey, look, you're going to be able to run multiple builds in parallel might be just the thing to get them on board. And in that kind of idea of getting your economies of scale is really an issue, because a lot of times one of the really big trends we see among enterprises right now is they're really trying to figure out how to scale development efficiently. And one of the issues does come around to developer onboarding. And that's why being able to invest in a common infrastructure, have training, have support is one element of scaling efficiently. But I think there's also a lot to be done around, information, both for information sharing, but also just if you think about this, what kind of information would you like to have about your development projects that would give you confidence? Right? That's going to be especially important as you start adding on new teams internally, if you start adopting offshoring to a greater extent, or even if you're outsourcing to a partner. What information would you like to have about their work so that you had confidence about what was going on? I think also there's people would like to have some common practices in place. And I know, Eric, this is something that you deal with frequently. Can you talk to us about some of the things people look for, such as, coverage targets or some sort of checks they'd like to see before they move past the build phase?
Sure. I think, even a classic one was, we've seen a situation where the company said, you know what, all of our projects will be doing unit testing. Right, and they should be shooting for 40%. We're going to be going for that. And then, they were doing a rollout of Antel Pro, and they brought us in for some services. Makes sense. And said, yeah, no, make sure that we've got our unit tests brought in all of our projects. I said, sure. And as we're doing our exploration, and as we start working with the teams, 4 teams out of 40 had any unit tests at all. And that was really a surprise for the enterprise architects, who were pretty sure that their mandated practices were being followed. So, even just is it happening at all is a key thing. But other things that we've seen have been a little bit more advanced, right? You must have your test coverage above some rate before you hand it off to QA, because we want the developers doing the first round of testing. Putting in those sorts of gates is reasonably common, and to do common reporting against that makes sense, especially when we have diverse sets of technology. When we've got Java and .NET, we've got different tools that are coming in, but we want some common standards across them. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think this is really a key point. You're really kind of getting there into that idea and the old dictum that what is measured matters, but really, what's measured is kind of the basis of what you can manage. And again, management, like from metrics, is something that can have a bad name because people think of it in the most punitive, top-down, heavy-handed, ham-fisted approach. And you want to be careful to not do that. But really, even making the metrics available to the team so that they know where they are. In my career, I found that to be a huge win for people, to actually give them insight on, how often their build is passing, how many tests they have, what their coverage level is. Even just, that kind of information that management will want to know that the practices are being followed can actually also be a huge aid to the team who would like to follow them, but without these kind of metrics actually lack the insight to know where they are. So, I think the reporting plays both aspects, both from the outside giving the organization some level of confidence that what they say should be done is actually being done, but also to the team itself, it can be a real boon. So rather than having to do a lot of manual work to make sure that they're in compliance, they can get feedback on where they're strong, where they're weak, and where they need to put more attention. So I think metrics and compliance can be a huge issue about why the enterprise approach, as opposed to the team by team or ad hoc approach, can yield benefits. And I think when we talk about now what happens now when you actually have teams or have data that you can share across teams, this is something that's becoming so important as you have more and more teams make a move, or more and more companies, I should say, make a move to small, discrete teams. As part of the move to Agile and Scrum, you more often find these scrums of scrums, smaller teams, and even in non-Agile places, you have the move to SOA, service-oriented architecture, where you have smaller, more collaborating services. Having a common reporting across them can lead to some benefits, and even more when you start having those things roll up into things that go across silo. Eric, you want to talk about some of the interesting use cases you've seen about feedback either between teams or across teams, across different functional areas from a common reporting system?
Sure. I think when we look at something like the dev versus QA silos, right, it can be helpful for the test teams to be able to see what sort of automated tests the developers have, what areas of the code base they have coverage on, even things like code complexity, what segments of the code base are really nasty in the code, which might indicate the places where there are most likely to be bugs. QA never has an abundance of time to test things. So if we can get them to focus on the areas that are most likely to break, that would be helpful. And I think there's also this idea of team to team, right? If I'm a developer who's doing one web service and you're a developer who's doing another web service, being able to see that you've just delivered a lot of changes, and then my stuff starts breaking out in the integration test environment, well, maybe that's the issue. Maybe you're passing me different data than you used to. So to have that insight in between either development teams or between development and QA can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That kind of impact analysis and sort of debugging, knowing what really happened. Having a common system with common reporting really helps you get to the root cause of problems so much faster. I think in a related vein of cross-silo and cross-team collaboration is something that comes down to more of a technical issue, which is the issue of dependency management. As you have more of these small teams, they're not only sharing information, they're also sharing their work output. And so the question is going to be, the challenge is going to be, how are you going to manage the actual build dependencies and the runtime dependencies between these different teams? And it's not just between teams, it's also things like what sort of third-party components are you using? Are you using a commercial library or open source libraries? Let's make sure that we have all of our teams using the official version of this open source library. Log4j is the classic example. Let's make sure every team has the same version of Log4j as we actually have in our runtime environment. That can be such a huge issue. You probably lack a really good way to have standardized dependency management and artifact management across these teams. And of course, we're big in the build pipeline, getting past the build. And again, this is going to be, if you solve this at build time, it's also going to be a good building block for your later deployment practices. So dependency management, we think, is a huge win and a real advantage of going to an enterprise approach. So with that, I think we've wrapped up our main selling points. Hopefully you're all convinced now. Yep, self-service build is the way to go. And yeah, it seems like it's worth doing at the enterprise. We'd like to have all those organizational benefits. And now this is not so much hopefully to temper your enthusiasm, but maybe just make sure you have your eyes open before you head into it. we let you know that there are some common pitfalls that people will run into when they go to implement an enterprise system like this. And some of these pitfalls apply to any enterprise level system, but it's worth knowing these as you head in. And we're going to kind of go through it, these four. First is the big issue of buy-in. We hit this up front a little bit, but it's worth revisiting because buy-in is such an important topic. Second is a caveat that as you go out and try to bring these different teams in your company into your enterprise solution, they're quite likely to be less standard than you think when you go out there to start. Third, there's some real things you need to think about when it comes to scalability. It's very tempting to say, we're going to take what worked at the team level and we're just going to use the same solution at the enterprise, but a lot of times that doesn't work out as well as you'd hope. So we'll talk about some of those scalability issues. And finally, there's the question of responsibility. How do you actually get these teams into the system and using it when the rubber hits the road? That can actually present some challenges. Now, all these things are not really necessarily difficult to deal with, but they're things that you can easily stumble into if you're not expecting them. So let's go through them one at a time. First of all, our big one on buy-in. Eric, this issue of team resistance is something that we've seen time and time again catch people out. The centralized team implementing the solution is so surprised when they don't get the buy-in they're looking for, when it takes longer than they expected to get teams on board. Do you want to talk through some of this issue and how you might address it?
Yeah, and I think the surprise is as much as anything the problem, because when you've read the right things and you've seen the right webcasts and you're like, wow, this is great stuff, I'm excited to do it, and you pitch it and you get somebody to say, yes, go run with this, right? It seems so self-evident at that point that a system like self-service builds is great, and it's really surprising when you show it to somebody else and they go, yeah, that seems okay, I guess, but I'm kind of busy with other things, so go away. And I think that catches people off guard, rather than realizing that that's completely to be expected. Most people are going to need to be convinced that it is worth their time and energy to get on board with something. And when you put together your little PowerPoint deck about why this is a great thing, realize that you're going to need a actually different PowerPoint deck for different teams, or a different way of communicating with different groups, right? That pitch of efficiency is going to work really well for developers, or really time savings might work for developers, whereas control is going to sell better to executives. So you need to make sure that you're talking with people and trying to understand what their motivations are, and focusing on how your solution is going to help them with their problems. And to a large degree, when you're talking about all these distributed development teams across the enterprise, this really requires having an open conversation with them and listening to them to see what their pain points are, and trying to say, oh, we can actually address your pain points with this aspect or that aspect. You might be putting in this system mostly because there were some failed audits, and you need to really get control over the process. But in order to get developers on board, you might have to set up continuous integration and get them really good metrics, which is something that really wasn't the main motivation, but might be a prerequisite to actually getting people on board so you can solve your main motivation. And so I think that's really the big theme here, is a lot of communication, a lot of understanding what people need and catering to them, while pushing over the kind of the core overarching vision. And then, Jeffrey, I think this last point is one that you like to talk about a lot, and that now is never the right time to migrate.
Yeah, it's very rare that we've ever come across a development team who says, we're so far ahead of schedule, we're just sitting around, we got nothing to do. Now would be a great time for you to come in and disrupt what we're doing because we're just not really that busy. That's just not something I've ever heard, right? People are always behind schedule. They're always under stress. Maybe if they're not behind schedule, they're on schedule. They don't want to go off schedule. There's always that deadline pressure, right? That's the norm. And so to think that people are just going to want to just drop what they're doing or add the extra task of, oh yeah, just do this work to get in the system. Yeah, it's not going to happen because they've got their eye on their schedules. And that's really where it's important that you're sensitive to that and really focus then on how you're going to actually help them. If you can explain to them how you're going to allow them to stay on schedule without, spending as much time in the office, say, yeah, those broken builds that we've been having so that we're not able to do our weekend rollout and you have to come in and fix the build, that's hopefully not going to happen anymore. That's going to is going to an argument that's going to win over a developer. Probably not the same argument you'd make to management, right? And that idea of understanding your audience, understanding their pains, I think is just essential to explain why it's we're going to take the time to make this trade. Now, one thing about bringing people on board, and I mentioned the concern about being disruptive. Part of it is you need to understand what people are currently doing, and so that you know how to make this onboarding process as smooth as possible. And one warning that we'll tell you, and this is very much from our experience, is that the teams out there are much less standard than you think. Eric, you had the great example of the team that had the challenge because of their different versions of Visual Studio required. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So, a team 100% Microsoft shop, which at first sounds like, all right, that rules out a lot of problems. We all have the same source control and bug trackers, and we're all on Windows, and this is great. But in order to standardize and have a central build infrastructure, they ended up having to install something like 4 different versions of Visual Studio on each build machine, right? Because they had everything from VB6 to the latest and greatest .NET and a slew of versions in between. And really, that's the easy case. When we look at, say a bank, right, that's been around for 50 years or 100 years, well, they've probably been acquiring other banks for most of that time, been doing software development for decades, and they've got every technology over the sun. They've got Java. They do have all those different kinds of Microsoft technologies. They've got mainframe work, just a huge variance. And so you have to go in with your eyes open, knowing that there's going to be a lot of those different sets of technologies that are going to need to be catered to a little bit. And then I think where it gets really tricky is when we start looking and saying, all right, but we have all of these teams, and they're, say, J2E web development. They're all trying to deploy to WebLogic, right? So these guys should all be pretty similar. And as often as not, when you go look at those, you'll find variances within those teams. Not only do they not all have the same build script that has the same targets, some don't even have build scripts. Some are building from the IDEs, some have build scripts, some are using Ant, some are using Maven. So you need to expect that there's going to be a lot of variance, and some of it is going to be really ugly, and some of it's going to be really beautiful. And so I'd like to, just do that little bit of an audit to try to understand what's out there, and bring the teams that really have their act together on board first, and get that under your belt, and then go look at the teams that are really doing crazy stuff. Anything you wanted to add to that, Jeff?
I think you pretty much covered it. I think the one thing that's striking to me is that given all the diversity, and I love your example because even teams using the same technologies. We're not talking about the team where you have all your build machines when you spec it out are all on Linux, and then you discover that actually you support your Visual Studio people also. But I'm thinking, even when you have everyone on Java, for example, and then you find out that this team has Maven, that team has Ant, this other team is actually just builds out of the IDE. You might be really surprised. And so it's really only at the output when you actually get the compiled products and you'll say, yeah, now after the build is when we can start really comparing the projects. We can start finding common ground and sharing the artifacts. And the fact that things upstream are different don't matter as much once we can get them in the same system. So I think it's kind of awesome actually how the build system can end up kind of being a good abstraction layer over a lot of these differences that might be very difficult to change, just as long as you can make sure you've got your system designed to take them into account. And as you go and address all these teams, one of the big issues are now going to be, can the solution actually scale? Can you bring in all these different teams that you have in mind? Because a lot of times the team level solutions might not scale up, and especially when it comes down to scale, one of the really oddities is this thing known as Jevons paradox, right? So you might be making plans based on what you've done previously when you're doing manual builds, But then things change. Eric, you want to explain Jevons paradox and how that relates to manual and automated builds?
Sure. I think, classic example of Jevons paradox is you've got some highway that's highly congested, so the city decides to add a lane onto the highway. All right, so big construction project, 3 years later, new lane, congestion is just as bad. And it's just as bad because a lot of people had been avoiding the highway because of the traffic, and then traffic got a little bit better, so they went back on the highway, and now you're back in the same boat. There's that same pain threshold. So in general, when you make it easier to consume some resource or do something, more people are going to do that. So if builds used to be a little bit painful, and now you put in a nice self-service build system so they're easy and pretty much free, you're going to have a lot more builds. So if you start speccing out your enterprise build system and you say, well, based on doing one build every 2 days as a standard for our teams, looks like we're going to need 3 build machines. All right. If your builds become free and you move from a build every couple of days to 10 builds per day because you're doing aggressive continuous integration all of a sudden, well, now you don't need 3 build machines, you need 40 build machines. And that can be a real surprise. And so I think you need to understand how making something more available will mean that it's consumed more and scale appropriately. Now that does mean we're going to need to be able to support a high volume of builds, and I think a diverse set of builds as well. Part of that whole idea of being a very heterogeneous environment, that's really common, is realizing that when we're speccing out our build farm, we might say, yeah, we're going to need 10 build boxes for the .NET guys, 10 for the Java guys. Let's say we got some Windows boxes and some Linux boxes. Oh, and then we have that old project that only builds on AIX, so we're going to need one of those and a Solaris box, and really making sure you've got that capacity both in bulk as well as in variance. Now the gotcha that we always hit, Jeff, is that the hardware needs to be allocated at budget time, not at rollout time. So this kind of does need to be thought through in advance, because 3 months after the budget has been finalized is not the right time to go asking for more hardware. It tends to irritate the business quite a lot. I think that's something you've seen a few times too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing quite like that sickening feeling when you're told that actually there's no space in the data center for those machines you'd like to order, and that you could have, of course, if we had the request, 6 months ago, we could have got you in the new data center. That kind of thing. You just would like to get those kind of issues ironed out ahead of time. So that's one of those real gotchas in planning that people should be thinking about. The other kind of scaling, there's one other kind of scaling I want to mention. It's not just the number of builds, but I think there's some secondary issues around, for example, policy, and even just simple things like the UI. And again, this is really where a lot of the naive approach of taking the team level solution doesn't scale. If I have a team with 5 builds and I have a simple list, that may not work when we get out and we have 500 projects, each with 5 builds. That just can be a very basic thing. People might anticipate those kind of UI issues, but I think what's going to be more surprising are the policy things, like the storage needs. Suddenly, the issues of retention for how long do we keep old builds become much more important. With the kind of scale and volume Eric was talking about, you're doing 10 builds a day. You don't want to keep all those clearly, and you're probably going to want to make sure those are automatically cleaned up. When we were doing it at the team level, and even if we were doing 10 builds a day, hard drives are big. They're really big compared to the artifacts from one team, but they're not really so big when you're looking at the output of 40 build machines building all day long. You can chew through that disk space a lot faster than you'd think. So that ends up being an issue. So there's a lot of policy issues like that become part of the scalability question. The last real gotcha that I think people sometimes don't anticipate is really the onboarding process. And the onboarding process really comes down, I think, to 3 different kinds of ownership, which is sort of who is like the product owner for the system, which is to say, who sets system policies and procedures. That could be different than who owns the system hardware and is required for maintenance and updating. And that, again, might be different from the question of who's going to do the actual work of onboarding. Now, Eric, I know you've been through this series of questions many times. Do you have any warning stories for us, or any recommendations you'd make along these lines?
I think the real challenge is just to realize that you need to figure this out, and to do it a little bit sooner rather than later, and really focus on all three of these aspects, and realizing that could be that two of them are handled by one team, or all of them are handled by one team, or it could be three different teams that need to work together and talk on a regular basis. So I think it's really just realizing that you have to do it and doing the work to sort out who's going to do what. Configuration management might be setting up the actual system and maybe doing the onboarding, and they might own the hardware and they might not. So again, just figure it out, I think, is my core piece of advice.
So you don't see this as necessarily the hard ones, just things that people sometimes overlook.
Yeah, I think it's more likely to be overlooked. And if it's hard, it's just an internal politics sort of hard, and not one that there's going to be fast rules for resolving. It's really going to depend a lot organization to organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think you got it right that but in our we have seen people that fail to plan for one of these issues. So for example, maybe they hadn't thought through the system hardware and maintenance, and were surprised to learn that actually the hardware they'd allocated was going to have to live in a data center that they hadn't been expecting, and it needed to now meet different compliance levels, and actually the policies for disaster recovery were different than expected, and it just hadn't been part of their planning process. And just ended up being a delay of getting infrastructure in place that threw them off schedule. I know I've seen that. I'm sure you've seen it as well. So that's kind of what we'd like to do: is share our experience, let you know other people have made these mistakes. Hopefully, you can then avoid them. And as an aid to help you with that, now we're going to get to our last point. What we look at as an evaluation template, and this came from a webinar that we did last year on Turn On Your Flashlight. You can actually see this from the Antelope Pro website. And the evaluation template is broken up in these pieces. The first two issues really have to do with what your motivation is. And there's two ways of looking at this. What's the motivating win? And there's what's the benefit? If you're talking to visionaries, what's the vision you're going to paint for them? This is the vision of it'll be great because we'll be able to do impact analysis, and we'll know ahead of time, and then we'll be able to guide our testing resources, and we're going to find problems sooner. It'll be awesome. And then you have the motivating problem, which is kind of the flip side. And that's really couched. I like to couch that really in personal terms about the pain that people feel, and pain will be felt differently in different organizations. From the management side, it might be, the pain of failing audit. We're going to solve that. We're not going to fail audit on our builds anymore because we're actually going to know what went into our builds. We have traceability of source. So it'll be great. But for a more personal level, it might be, you're going to be able to not have to be called into the office on the weekend to help fix build problems. That kind of language is what I'm looking for. Then we get into this idea of what your belief is, right? What your assumption is, and then a survey for actual status. And so these are two things that go together, but they're done separately. Ahead of time, as you're designing your system, you're saying, great, we're going to need these things, and we're pretty sure, we think all of our teams actually have their own build script. We don't know what they are, but we think that they have them, and we think that they have unit tests. Then you go out and you find the actual status, and you find out, oh, actually not everyone has a standardized build script. They're not all using Ant. They're using a whole diverse set of things, and actually they don't even know what libraries they use. Right? It turns out that we have this big folder of all the libraries, and teams really don't know what they have. Wow, I had no idea that we didn't know that. And plus, the unit tests, as Eric mentioned, we think everyone's doing unit testing. Turns out most people aren't. So try to know those things ahead of time. Finally, when you look at kind of our caveats, you look at everything we're talking about, really try to understand your required investment, right? And understand what are the preconditions to achieve the win that you're after. So, for example, if your vision requires that everyone actually already has unit tests, and they don't have unit tests, then you actually need to have an investment greater than just putting a build system in place, right? The build system is going to be probably an important step, but it's not going to get you all the way to that vision. That's not a problem, but you need to know that going in. And finally, if you look back at the pain, is solving the pain going to justify the investment required? If we talk to people, you go around the organization, and it says, yeah, things aren't perfect, but really we don't have any problems. you might want to stop. Maybe this isn't worth moving forward. I mean, maybe things aren't as good as they could be, but if things are pretty much okay, you're probably not going to get the buy-in you need to actually move the project forward. Good to know that ahead of time before you make a case for some elaborate investment. Unless there's some win that that's going to be so tremendous to justify it, that you can make that case. Otherwise, you might end up hitting your head into a brick wall, and you can save yourself a lot of pain by understanding this ahead of time. So this is all very generic. Eric, can you walk us through an example where we actually apply this to this problem of self-service builds? Kind of walk us through this example.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we're looking at self-service builds, a high-level version of this template would be something like, hey, we want to save our developers time or the release manager's time. We want to be more consistent. We want to do our builds right. Right. Why? Well, we just failed an audit where we didn't actually have very good traceability, with what we were deploying back to source. So not only do we have that sort of problem, but we do know our developers are spending a lot of time on this. So we're spending a lot of time and failing, and that's a bad thing. So let's try to improve this. So we might think, well, we've got to at least have some build scripts. All right, and I think this is exactly what you were going through. But in reality, perhaps we don't. Half our teams don't use build scripts. Half are just building out of the IDE. And some that do have build scripts, well, they're not even portable, right? That says go and use C:"build. And if that's the plan, and we're going to be building on Linux boxes, it's just not going to work terribly well. And if two teams are doing it, then we're going to have some conflicts. So we might need to make more portable scripts that actually get out of a lot of hard-coded paths. And speaking of kind of hard-coded paths, the related idea is this magic build machine. It's like, yeah, the build works on that one machine. We don't really understand why. We sure hope it doesn't catch on fire, because if it does, we just have no idea how we're ever going to do a build again. So we see that sort of situation a lot. And then you got to, from there, you see some of those problems like you were talking about with, well, if we want to publish a lot of unit test results, well, we're going to have to invest in unit tests. If we want to automate self-service builds, well, then we're going to need to make all of our projects buildable in a portable way, right? They can't be dependent on magic build machines or scripts that use a lot of hard-coded values. And there's going to need to be scripts, so we're going to have to create those things. And so once you kind of go and you talk to all the teams, you could even create one of these outlines on a per-team basis, which will really help you with that motivating win, what's going to get them on board. And that's going to help feed into the overall actual status as well. Do we in general have build scripts, or do we in general not? Is there anything you want to add, Jeff?
No, I think that's great. I mean, and again, I can't stress this enough. This is based on hard-won experience. So this might seem very obvious, but can't tell you the number of times we've gone in places where people hadn't done some of this due diligence ahead of time, and were surprised at the level of investment required to get where they wanted to go. And it's not to say it wasn't worth it, but you'd like to avoid those surprises. So if we've done our job and convinced you that enterprise self-service builds are what you want to do, hopefully we've given you now some good caveats that you can use and to avoid some of the same problems. And this template, I really like the format of this, because I think it really encapsulates in a very succinct way kind of what you need to take into account in your planning. So I'm a fan of this. I keep references as we go throughout. People might have seen the references that we're actually drawing a lot of material here that we've talked through before. We have quite a number of white papers and webinars up on our website and that talk through these issues in more detail than we've done today. So if you want to learn more about sort of removing bottlenecks, I would say take a look at the one about the lean economy. If you're really interested in the dependency management aspects, take a look on the talk on binary repositories. If you want more about the issues of scaling up to enterprise level concerns, take a look at the implementing, build, deploy, test, release automation enterprise. And if you want to learn more about that evaluation template and how to use it in your project planning, take a look at Turn on Your Flashlight as a webinar of choice. And with that, I think we're ready to turn it to questions of the audience.
Good job, guys. Great presentation. And we do have a few questions. So also, if you have any additional questions for Jeffrey or Eric, go ahead and submit your questions in the chat box below the presentation window. Well, here's the first question for you. Someone's asking their developers do a build from their IDE and post it to a shared folder to hand off to QA. And this has been working for us. What argument should I use to try and get a control build system in place?
Well, that's tough because you kind of have the two things there. You have this process that's going on that is probably not ideal, having things go to the shared folder, from the IDE. You really don't have that traceability back to source. And you say it's working, so I think that really goes back to, is there some place where it is causing a problem for you now or could cause a problem for you in the future? So for example, if you're going to be audited and you need to show traceability to source, well, you know what, you're going to need to fix that. It may feel like it's working. It's a case where once this goes out to production, you're going to want to know, that you actually have the source from the branch that you made for release. If you are just doing it from the IDE, you don't really have that traceability. So I think you have the kind of thing that a system that feels like it's working because you actually haven't hit the problem that it fails at. But these are problems that you can anticipate, and people should be with enough experience will in any team have said, yeah, eventually we will make mistakes, we will have problems. That's the way of software. Let's try to avoid that pain ahead of time. Anything else you'd add to that, Eric?
I think you nailed it. There are some places where I cringe at this, like, wow, they're all part of it 20 different ways. But if it's never far apart, then good for you. Right. Then it's fine. If it seems likely to fall apart, if there's a lot of risk being introduced to business, then I think really understanding that risk, making pitch based on risk, and saying, look, we've been lucky so far. That's the reason it's worked for us.
Hey, Eric, it sounds like your audio has gone south a little bit there, so I'll post another question for Jeffrey. Maybe we can come back around to Eric again. So, Jeff, are there any specific features that can be highlighted as strong points of Anthill Pro when compared to other solutions like TFS? Yeah. I think I don't want to spend all the time on the product side of things. We're more than happy to address product issues. Contact us offline. I think that the biggest issue, I'll just say this, is that we really have been doing this for a long time. Eric mentioned that the first version of Anthill Pro, the OS version, came out in 2001. So we have 10 years experience doing build automation. We have customers who've used us for a number of years who scale up to really huge teams, literally thousands of builds a day. So in those issues of scalability, we've been there. Certainly, hopefully you've heard throughout this presentation our experience, both of our services and also our product reflect a lot of these lessons learned. So the kind of issues we've talked about here around built-in dependency management, artifact repository, that kind of stuff, it's baked into our solution as well as in our experience. So those are the main things I would mention compared to some of the team level things like you might get from a TFS. Not to mention, of course, the whole build pipeline, what happens after the build. We can address that as well. But I don't want to spend too much time on the product issues. I'll just say, yeah, we're great. Sure. Alrighty, so another question for you then. Our QA group only takes one build a week. Is there any point in having an automated build if we're only doing one build a week?
Wow, that's a great question. Because this is really common. I think it's extremely common that people have set up a process where QA people take one or two builds a week with the idea that they don't want to disrupt the QA testing process. And what they're really choosing there is to have stability in QA as opposed to faster feedback on the build. Now, a lot of times the reasons for that are historical. Maybe there was in the past, there was a very high incidence of bad builds coming out of development. And they kind of have this as a defensive measure. I think so. The question would be, are you putting a system in place that will make it so that the old problems are no longer there? So if you can put a build system in place that has some amount of self-validation in, and you can say that, yeah, we have some confidence that in fact the build is going to work, and therefore not going to disrupt QA and take them off their schedule, you're more likely to get buy-in that they'll take it more rapidly. So I think and I think even beyond that, there's certainly a lot of reasons to do the rapid builds, because just letting the developers know, hey, your code compiled. Hey, your code's passing tests. Hey, your code, we found this, the static analysis found this likely defect. You might want to check that out. If you can resolve those problems before they get to QA, before they get to that QA build, hey, that's fantastic. If we can solve a bunch of problems before that weekly QA deployment, your QA is going to be in so much better shape. It's totally worth making that investment. So I think there's both halves of that. Eric, do you want to try again and see if you're still doing the spaceman audio, or if things are working out okay? Eric? Well, I think it's we're on spaceman. We're in space audio, so maybe we'll go on to the next question.
Alrighty. So another question. Person said their best performing teams have put together their own build system, and the engineer who did it is considered to be their CI expert. So he's got that team working great, but he's vetoed any attempts to get a standardized tool in place. Are we better off sticking with each team using their own approach, or should we try to override them and get a centralized tool in place?
That's an irony. I think I actually mentioned this in my presentation, that we've seen this at other places. A lot of times it makes sense. You have someone who is very focused on their team. And a lot of times it's like a lead developer who was an early evangelist for continuous integration, probably unit testing, maybe static analysis, maybe metrics, maybe all kinds of stuff, right? This is probably someone who's really innovative and up on the latest stuff, and they're just, they've got all this kick-ass stuff working on their team, and that's fantastic. Now, they're probably evangelizing this kind of practices internally, or even if they're not actively evangelizing it, the results speak for themselves. People can look at the system he's put together and they get, hey, Fred really understands this stuff. If we're going to do anything related to this sort of build automation stuff, we got to talk to Fred because he's clearly our expert. Now, I think what's important to know, though, is that psychology, that sort of go-getter, Fred's, kind of the mentality of the commando, he's going to do whatever it takes to get the job done. That's great for his team, but it may not be it's not the same kind of attitude you have of saying, hey, how can I get everyone on board, right? Fred's focused on fixing his problems and his team. He may not be the proper person to listen to as far as the benefits of everyone else. Now, one real viable option is, hey, maybe we need a system that everyone else uses, but we'll still let Fred's Tiger team be the advanced guard. Let them go explore new paths, and they don't necessarily need to use the standard system because they figured out something that works for them. That might be a way of lessening Fred's fear that he's going to have to give up his ability to solve problems. Because I think that's probably what's at root of it. You have someone who's been very proactive about solving their own challenges. They are probably a little bit worried about losing their ability to perform at the high level that they're used to. So there's a couple different ways to address that. One is to not require them to change, and the other, though, is to say, yeah, go ahead and do what you want, but we're going to keep working on the common system. And the best case scenario is you can end up coming to something that's actually better than what they're using on his team. And at that point, it'll be a win for him to switch over. He'll be like, great, you guys have nailed it, and we can make that switch. Now, if it's the kind of situation where that still doesn't happen, then you need to have a little talk with Fred about what his other concerns are. But it's worth understanding what his concerns are and what he would consider an ideal solution, rather than just ignoring him. And I think it's also worth having a discussion rather than letting it fall back to every team, because you know what? Not every team has a Fred. Not every team has that guy who's going to step up and make it work. And you don't want to require actually having heroic effort on every team as standard operating procedure, because I don't think that's scalable. I don't think you can rely on that everywhere. So I think for that reason, it's really worth looking at the enterprise solution, even if you've had great success at the team level.
Great. Well, Eric, I don't know if you're still there. If you want to add anything to that, I don't know if your mic's working again or not.
I hope it is, but I think Jeff knocked it out of the park on that one.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Alrighty. Well, I think we've come to the end of another great hour of presentation. Nice presentation today, guys, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Patrick.
All right.
Great to be here.
Sure. All right. Well, thanks to everyone who joined us today and everyone who helped put this webcast on today. I look forward to seeing you on our next CM Crossroads webcast series event. And goodbye, everyone.